Today we're going to talk about supply chain finance. We're going to spend some time actually talking about some of the finance component to it. You've heard a lot this morning and actually also in a prior conference yesterday, a lot about more of the logistical, more of the kind of infrastructure side of it. This panel here is very much the experienced practitioners that are running programs or are providing kind of consultative approaches, as well as technology and platforms around the actual finance component, finance structuring of the supply chain piece of it. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to start and ask our panelists just to introduce themselves, and then I'll end with myself, and then we'll start with our actual panel discussions. So maybe Alvin, we can start from the end with introductions. Start with you and work ourselves in.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Alvin Bueno. I'm with Nestle USA and I'm the director of global supply chain practice. So I work with our brands worldwide for all our markets at Nestle.
Hi, good morning. My name is Pete Stathis. I'm with Restoration Hardware. I'm Vice President of Vendor Operations and Risk Management. Similar to Alvin, I work with our suppliers across the world, primarily in Asia, to develop programs for them to provide them access to working capital that they might otherwise not have access to.
Good morning, I'm Paul Bingham. I'm with information analytics company IHS Markit. I'm in their economics and country risk division. My background is economics consulting, and we provide consulting advice and applications of data and modeling for supply chain finance across a number of different sectors globally. And I'll be talking about that, I'm sure, a little bit later.
And good morning, my name is Chris Colley. I'm with a company named Talia. I'm the FinTech representative on the panel today. Talia is based in San Francisco, and we run a cloud-based financial supply chain finance platform with about 2 million suppliers participating with about 130 buyers or large global obligors.
Thank you. I am Fiona Guru. I'm with Bank of America. I head up our global trade sales division for the Americas, based out of Chicago despite the accent, and have enjoyed so far 24 years at Bank of America. So I'm excited to be here and to host this panel. Let's start off, first of all, with maybe level setting. Very, very basically, everyone knows what supply chain is. Supply chain finance is, but there's a lot of different terminologies out there. So let's start off, supply chain finance. The logic here is probably best described as early payment discount. You'll hear receivables factoring, you'll hear accounts payables financing, you'll hear supply chain finance. It's all a description of the very same thing, early payment discount. This is basically as a buyer, you submit an invoice to your supplier who submits the purchase order, and then the payment journey starts, right, through a funder, through a bank, or through an investor, and it's the ability to pay early at a discount. And then the funder provides the actual risk and funding to take that journey of the transaction. So if you keep in your mind early payment discount, it really is a very simple sort of transaction to keep in mind. So with that, I'm first going to pick on Alvin and on Pete to just maybe describe their programs that they have today. Pete, maybe I'll start with you. Can you describe from a supply chain finance program perspective, what does it look like at Restoration Hardware?
So we have a very, very basic supply chain finance program. So with respect to our program, I think I have to level set a little bit. Our suppliers are very much treated as artisans, so they're not manufacturers in the traditional sense of what the manufacturers are. We have merchants who go out to trade shows in Europe and Asia, and they see a really nice table or chair, and we ask them to develop or manufacture or build 1,000 units instead of 100 that they normally do. So they don't have the access to financial infrastructure. And our goal and objective is to set forth a program for them that gets us access to the working capital. So early on in our life cycle, we would provide them loans, advances, deposits. And fast forward to 2014, and we become a public company, enter the public markets, and things such as working capital become a very important element of being in the public markets. And so we try to look at a lot of options in terms of what is available out there. We look at some things like dynamic discounting, and that's sort of sophisticated. And where we ended up with Bank of America, it provides our suppliers access to working capital at a very affordable rate. So if you do the modeling, it's very different from traditional factoring because the rate is actually a number of basis points. So we extended suppliers from prepayment net 0 to net 60. So we've consequently improved our DPOs from 20 days to 60 days, and the impact on the operating cycle has been significant. We probably added, let's call it $30 to $50 million improvement in working capital. So it was very easy to implement and very fair and equitable across the supply chain. And when I speak about the supply chain, I only refer to those merchant suppliers who build products for us. It's not expensive. So I hope that answered it.
That's a great description. Thank you, Pete. Alvin, can you jump in? Nestle, what does the finance program look like?
So we partnered with the and initially we launched it, at least for the US markets. We targeted the larger vendors first, but we targeted online. So the program pretty much is, think of it this way. So Nestle pays 90 days, as an example, it could be 60 days, and a vendor gets paid in 10. So the cost of carrying that is based on Nestle's credit rating. So the cost of financing is cheaper. So you'll have vendors that may need liquidity, and that's a way of paying cheap liquidity to grow their business and to cover business needs. To some vendors, it's attractive. Other vendors that may not need liquidity, it's not as attractive. So at the end of the day, we're trying to establish a minimum for both. Because now you would expand Nestle's terms and you improve the ability of your suppliers.
How many suppliers do you, Nestle, I think about thousands. How many suppliers do you have in your program?
Right, so if you look at Nestle's base of suppliers worldwide, you're talking about over 500,000. But if you look at the employee world, so every business has concentration, right? So, and actually I learned that from Rand's class, I think. He's my professor here. So when you look at 500,000, actually last time we looked it was 549,000 and some change. So about 13,000 of those members make up 80% of spend worldwide for Nestle, all categories. So Nestle, you might think, oh, it's a chocolate company, or oh, it's a coffee company. Well, it's a wide spectrum of businesses. And if you think about it, we buy commodities, transportation, services, minerals, advertising, you name it, it's there. So the supplier category base is very wide, but only about 13,000 make up 80% of spend. So those are initially the ones we targeted, and then as part of our supply chain risk program, we look at the condition of the vendors financially, which are the ones that might have potential issues, and those are the ones that we seek partnering with, so that we can help with liquidity and at the same time reduce our risk. So over 500,000 suppliers, about 13,000 make up 80% of spend. But it doesn't mean that the risk is limited to those 13,000. Because I had a conversation with someone earlier about a critical single source vendor can stop your production. So it's not necessarily spend, you have to look at the criticality of those vendors. So when you're talking about a supply chain funding or finance program, it's not just wise to look at the spend, but also the criticality of your vendors.
Let's take the next step then. So programs, suppliers, working capital improvement, millions of dollars of opportunities in more efficient operating cash flow. how does it all come together? How do you start this journey? Constituencies across the organization. I'm sure Alvin didn't wake up one morning and said, let's just go ahead and do this. How do you build that connectivity internally at Nestle before going externally? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a little bit more complex because we have different markets, different operating units in place. Honestly, the way it started in Switzerland. We're a Swiss-based company. And the program started there, and then basically it was launched specifically by market or by region, because of different players and different stakeholders and different needs. So specifically for the US, when we initially launched it, we just targeted the larger ones. And since my team was looking at risk, it was just natural to focus on the ones that were more risky, that could benefit from a working capital program to expand their or enhance their liquidity. So that's how we started. It started slow. It was slow to gain traction. But if you think about 5 years ago, it was a concept that was not easy to explain. Nowadays, supply chain, it's more open to those types of programs. Supply chain finance is more common. So if we look at this whole supply chain management program at USC, okay, I first covered. So I remember when I first started, I was a finance person in a supply chain program, and I was kind of like, that square peg in the round. And I wanted to learn about supply chain, so I had all these crazy ideas about merging the risk and the finance and the supply chain. And when I would bring up concepts about working capital improvement, it was kind of like alien. But now it's more commonplace. So to your point, it's an evolving journey. And it's about how you communicate it with your vendors and make them understand it. Because they don't automatically understand the finance piece. The finance piece is not, or the finance folks don't automatically understand the supply chain mechanisms.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into that, and I'll open it up to everyone on the panel here. So I think about that journey. I think about, you mentioned finance, you mentioned sort of IT. Who do you have to rally in the organization? Who do you see critical to literally buying in on working capital improvement initiative? How does this get funded internally?
For us, Fiona, it was really quite easy. I mean, we had huge endorsement from our CFO. It was an imperative thing that we had to implement. We needed working capital for other initiatives, such as our real estate ventures, and we build these galleries that we now see restoration market development, entering into the hospitality market. So we had a lot of support at the CFO level, and subsequently, when it was announced, we immediately got traction into the merchant organization. So it was quite easy for us to do it. The challenge was finding the right solution, right? And we looked at a lot of different solutions. One thing that was important and critical to us was making sure that we got the payables treatment as opposed to having indebtedness on the balance sheet, and this program achieves that. So it was quite easy across the organization to get buy-in. The challenge was just finding the right partner, the right solution in America.
So the messaging from the
Messaging came from
CFO
the top, right?
kind of saying, this is
Right.
it, this is what we're doing, term extension, and now everyone else starts buying into it.
Absolutely.
It's interesting. Paul,
I
Chris?
think in some industries we've seen, as Jeff mentioned this morning, it's, the treasury, the CFO is important, but it's also, you've got to have perhaps even at the CEO level support if you're dealing with procurement. Perhaps to adjust some incentives, as Jeff was mentioning this morning, procurement's not always on the same page in terms of what their performance metrics are. So in some organizations, it takes that very senior level leadership to try to enable the potential to make the gains.
Yeah, what I would say is it starts with what is the working capital goal? And a lot of times we're approached by the CFO or the treasurer, Chris. Our goal is to release $500 million to the balance sheet in the next 6 to 9 months. How can you help us scale and automate to achieve that across the entire supply chain. Tolly is a fintech platform, so we do that through technology, and we integrate with our buyer customers' back-end ERPs. And so IT is a very important constituent that we need to spend time with upfront in implementing the solution. In terms of change management, so there's the technical side of it, to get the systems talking, the data flowing, and the automation. But then there's the change management side, which is really where procurement comes into play. Because procurement has all of the coveted relationships with the suppliers. And it's procurement that's going to be entertaining a potential term extension with their suppliers. So they're a really important constituent. The other thing, though, that happens is the treasurer turns around to me and says, okay, Chris, we're going to do this early payment program. It's going to be third-party funded. By whom? By their coveted banking relationships, and i.e. Bank of America, and for lots of important reasons. Talia is a software company. We don't have a balance sheet. We're not in revolvers and term loans, and that's where Talia's very important partnership with the funders comes into play. So there's so many constituents to make a program come to fruition. Implementing it, and then once it's up and running, driving the value.
I think we heard that. I'll pick on Jeff. Made the comment as well this morning. Jeff Regan this morning. The keynote is, it really is not uncommon walking into meetings and different functions at companies introducing themselves because IT has not met with procurement in the past, or finance, etc. And so it really becomes part of the glue of the organization as you go through, I'll call it an initiative of working capital improvement through kind of a supply chain financing program. It can really drive a lot of connectivity as well, and it's really, really critical. As Alvin mentioned, the supplier relationship, the sourcing teams, so rightly so protective of those supplier relationships that are so key to delivering for the brand, delivering for the organization. And you need to make sure that you can extend the program to everyone that can kind of play part and has a real need. You've got some suppliers that have got very strong credit standings. You've got others that might have a weaker credit standing, and so they really can benefit from leveraging the credit profile of an display of restoration hardware and actually get that sort of cheaper financing to drive that journey. So let's keep going on this. We've talked about bringing different constituencies. We've talked about sort of IT, finance, making sure the CFO kind of stands tall to how we're going to have the drive and a need towards working capital improvement. Many journeys to get there. Pete, you talked about an actual specific sort of initiative on getting X amount of millions of dollars to be able to put back in to open up stores, do other things. We've also commonly seen companies that are actively trying to pay down debt, right? And take out some of that working capital, shall we say, lockup in that operational flow, and they use it to pay down debt. So it's really driving healthier suppliers, healthier buyers throughout the journey. Sounds very rosy. A lot of work to get there. Stumbling blocks. What are some of the challenges? CFO can say this is really important. Does that really make everyone jump and act and react and do the right thing necessarily? Paul, what have you seen when you speak to and work with a number of different companies? How easy is it to really carry that message through?
I think there's some real challenges, especially in global supply chains where some dimensions of the company management is regionalized, where you may have a corporate headquarters perspective, but there may be some authority and control down at the region level, which then affects some of the ability to have, say, procurement work with finance to take advantage of the opportunities. And Sometimes that requires a shift, change management in organizational authority that has to be driven by a higher level, perhaps like the CEO, to change the way control and authority and incentives are in place to be able to have the enterprise take advantage of that. Another big challenge, I think, sometimes is the capacity or the ability, as we touched on, of the supplier base to be able to work with the change that's coming from the primary company that you're dealing with. In some cases, they may want to take advantage of the opportunities, but may themselves have impediments, especially when the company is dealing with a whole set of suppliers, where your suppliers may have other customers, and you may not be the most important customer of a particular supplier, who then may have less incentive to make sure you're advancing at the pace you want to advance for the program for them to participate.
And Chris, also, we hear about dynamic discounting, we hear about supply chain finance, we hear about a number of different. How do they complement each other? Do they complement each other, or do they cannibalize?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Back to my first point, which was the CFO saying, we start with what is your working capital strategy. We're talking about working capital improvement, release of cash to the balance sheet, et cetera. Great. I would say 60, 70% of the corporates that we talk to, that is a goal. If you go back a few years, a lot of corporates had a lot of cash on the balance sheet, and it was invested in short-term this, short-term that, making peanuts. In some countries, negative short-term interest rates, right? And so they wanted return on excess cash on the balance sheet. And so that's where we start. What is the goal? What are you after? An early payment program is an early payment program on a corporate's, in our case, approved payables. Once the payable is approved, it can be offered back to the supplier for early payment. The early payment can come from the corporate's balance sheet if they're looking to capture a discount. That would be EBITDA improvement, reduction in cost of goods sold, and/or it can be third-party funded, of course. So when we talk about dynamic discounting versus supply chain finance, I actually don't like to use those terms. I like to just say it's an early payment program, and then how it's funded is the interesting part. Because in today's market, a lot of CFOs are saying, wow, that's interesting, Chris. You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to do both at the same time. I'd like to use our balance sheet for daily liquidity limits that they can set and configure at or above their hurdle rates for some return. And then they like to use their bank's balance sheet, where there's capacity for other funding. So it's a combination. So I think breaking it down into early payment program, self-funding by the corporate versus third-party funding is where we really look at it.
Right, if I can add a little bit to that, when you look at dynamic funding and you offer, let's say, a 2% discount, your supplier's bottom line is affected by that 2% discount, right? And it costs you a 2%, right, to your bottom line. But when you have a vendor-funded or a supply chain funded model, then in essence, you're stretching your terms, you're benefiting your working capital, you're improving the liquidity of your vendor, but that funding cost goes back to your vendor. So dynamic discounting costs you to your bottom line, but when you have a supply chain funding model, you eliminate that dynamic cost at 2%. Think about every buck that you make, you're giving out 2 cents, right? So you eliminate that. Now the cost is shifted to your supplier, but they get the benefit of the working capital or the liquidity based on your credit rating. And in some cases, some of these suppliers may not have access to the cash as cheaply as a larger conglomerate with a AAA rating. Or in some cases, it might not be available at all. So that's the benefit. It's a cash flow benefit versus a bottom line benefit.
So, you had asked about some of the challenges. For us, we have the 80-20 rule. We probably have 100 suppliers who get 80% of our business. The challenge was implementing this program to the smaller suppliers who are less sophisticated. and we're in parts of the world where banking is a little challenging. But it was very easy to deliver the message across the organization because of the benefits, right? Working capital benefits. And it helps things in supply chain, such as improving lead times and improving quality, because suppliers now have access to capital that they can always have, and at a very low cost. It's significantly less than the rate that they would try to achieve within their country. So the delivery of the message was very easy. Where it's a little bit challenging is getting the smaller suppliers implemented into the program.
I think one other point on the challenges that we face is there's this macro goal, release of cash to the balance sheet, and then we come in and we look at the corporate environment to implement the program. And then we find out they've got 10 different instances of SAP and Oracle, and they got this legacy mainframe and BS environment, and then they say, oh, Chris, there's no parent guarantee. We've got these 20 subsidiaries that you got to go do full KYC, and they're the obligors, and they each have independent payment responsibility, of the maturity. And then they got suppliers spread all over the world. So you got jurisdictional compliances, there's a lot of considerations, including currencies, right? Because these payments are made in multiple different types of currencies around the world. So there's it can get very complicated very quickly when you're dealing with a large multinational.
How do you address that? That's a lot of, I think about if I'm sitting in procurement and I'm working with my sourcing group, and they've got these key relationships with these suppliers that they just don't want to disrupt, and you've got all these, challenges. How does that go?
Yeah.
How do you get to comfort zone?
Yeah, I mean, the way to narrow in on it is we perform a very thorough spend analysis. Right? We will get a spend file from corporate across their ERPs, a simple extract, and then we start to do a lot of concentration analysis. Where is the spend concentrated? In what regions of the world? In what currencies? What jurisdictions? What are the payment term concentrations? What are
So you can get that just from market knowledge, market data as to where certain packaging companies tend to have their payment terms out and so on.
Yeah, and with respect to data, Talia does have a very large network. I mentioned 2 million suppliers transacting. So we have visibility into suppliers by spend category, by geography around the world. We know their DSOs, we know their payment terms across lots of relationships. A lot of that is confidential and it's treated confidentially, but that can be aggregated and inferences can be shared on that information so that we can go back to a corporate and ask their member of restoration and say, here are our recommendations on what we think is within the realm of the possible. Because, again, we want to make sure that these suppliers are held out with fair and reasonable terms, fair and reasonable early payment offers, better than alternate sources of financing, etc.
Did you have anything else, Pete? No, I
That's
wasn't
great.
sure. So then we think about, as humans, we have this insatiable demand to just consume. Whether it is the latest iPhone, whether it is, the latest car, whether it is, the best interior design for the new home. We're constantly trying to consume. Just it's part of our, I think, nature, and that drives accelerated growth, right? I know we saw some stats around, Walmart and Target and some of their sort of volumes taking a slight different journey, but a lot of it's going online now, right? It's not necessarily going away. We're not consuming less goods. So I think about the risk, and I think about as corporations, as funders, how you potentially can have concentration risk in suppliers, in countries, in funding partners. Alvin, I know you spend a lot of time specifically on the risk side. You mentioned that really early on as well. What are some of those risk elements that kind of keep you up at night that you think about?
You know, the main one is like when you do single source or sole source for the vendor. Think about it this way. I mean, go back a decade. The whole move was consolidate your supplier base for better pricing. But that added risk. Before you had maybe, let's say, 100 suppliers. Now you collapse it to 10. So that means if one supplier goes bad, yeah, the impact is 10 times greater than one smaller supplier going bad. So now you have more risk of your operations going idle and the long-term impact of lost market share. So from a risk perspective, consolidation, sole sourcing, having a handful of vendors and not having alternate sources, either because there are not that many larger players, or they're in countries where the political environment is not that stable, or tariffs might become a problem down the road. So concentration of your supplier base, that's one of the things that concerns me a lot, especially when you're not factoring in risk and contingency strategies. Now, if I want to take that into like a reverse factoring, if you think about it, the impact is not, from a risk perspective, the impact is not augmented because you're already receiving the product. You're extending your payment and you're accelerating payment to this vendor. So it doesn't really change the risk aspect because you already took possession of the product anyways.
It's more the diversification of the supplier base, maybe a little bit sort of heightened right now with some challenges with access to quality capital in certain countries around the world. That fluctuates sort of around the world. So China right now is a bit more challenging getting good access to quality capital. So that can drive some demand as well for you.
But at the end of the day, it's managing that risk appetite. Because you can diversify your supplier base, but at what cost? Now you're procuring less units from a wider base of suppliers, so your pricing will probably not be as good as procuring from one supplier, obviously. It's that volume part of it, volume strategy. Let's say you consolidate all your vendors into one, and if that vendor goes bad, your whole operations are at risk. So you have to balance that risk appetite from a leadership perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we specialize in as consultants to large enterprises is providing a framework to do that risk analysis across the many dimensions that need to be balanced, and leaving the decision-making up to the customers, but providing a framework so that you have country-specific risk, industry-specific risk, components of factor pricing, wages and commodity prices, political risk, similarly quantified and organized in a way that you can put your supply chain relationships in the context of those dimensions, and then make the decisions about how much mitigation you're trying to plan for, and embed in your management of the supply chains with an acceptable level of risk that you decide based on looking at your suppliers and the context in which they operate.
If you have a partner like Paul, that's great, but when you don't have that partner and you're trying to mitigate the unknown risk, or even worse, you're not mitigating the unknown risk, that's when you're really walking into a black swan potential where everything can go bad. And when everything goes bad, it puts at jeopardy your whole enterprise.
I think one thing I'll add is these programs are generally, about the working capital or about the risk capture. But we have had instances, maybe more so in Europe, maybe than North America, but even here, and even amongst this group, oftentimes it's about supply chain health. It's about de-risking the supply chain. It's about offering an early payment offer to the supplier without a term extension. So again, different objectives are important to different corporations, right? Based upon their cultures, based upon their values, based upon, and we're getting that more often. No, Chris, we're not going to extend terms, but we would still like to do this. Use our quote credit to de-risk and promote supply chain health. It's corporate social responsibility.
It is, absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to recap us, and I'm going to open us up to questions here. So I think we started off with, the supply chain journey, how you kind of take ownership, how it is really critical to ensure that through such a financing program, you have the right champions internally to really drive that forward. There are hundreds of unsuccessful supply chain finance programs out there, and typically driven by lack of ownership, typically driven by lack of accountability in really leveraging the benefits. So really important to have that drive internally as to what is this program going to solve for, and how critical is it to us as a company. Two is ensuring that then you've got the right metrics, the right people involved and champions that keep that journey going, that make it part of the regular DNA of your treasury, I'll call it, functions. And then it is being aware of the risks, whether it's supplier concentration, supplier diversification, country changes, and being flexible, having funding partners that can move through that change, whether it's economic, again, whether it is supplier driven, or whether it's brand driven, where you might be acquiring another brand or spinning off another brand, having that flexibility to shift that program around. And so I think that that's really the key thing is supply chain finance programs can fail really easily if you don't have focus, if you don't have the actual drive internally in the company to really push this through and make it part of everyday cash management, working capital DNA. Having the right technology, having the right support in there. So let me pause there, see if there's anything else from the panel that you wanted to add, and then if not, we'll open it up to questions and see what is top of mind for you. I think we've got a microphone if needed. Yep, gentleman right behind you.
Thank you very much. Thomas Schmelzberg from DB Schenker. This question is for you, Johan. I'm interested, you mentioned that in the model where there is a banking partner or a sort of finance source in the background, you use the credit rating of an Nestlé or a restoration partner. How do you achieve this? Is there some kind of a guarantee required, or because that's really where the rubber hits the road now?
Sure. So what we do is clearly customers of Bank of America, so we have a credit profile, we understand what the borrowing ratio is, we understand what the internal credit appetite is to extend credit out, and we can leverage that. So we tap into that appetite of our appetite to be able to extend credit on behalf of Nestlé or Restoration Hardware, and we carve out literally a portion of that credit line, and we set that aside and say that is going to be tagged to supporting a supply chain finance program. That gives us the comfort, and that gives us the ability to basically extend that out to the suppliers as well.
So I think I understood your question differently. Let me give it a stab. So the actual risk from a BOA is not augmented because Nestle took in the case of Nestle, let's say, since you mentioned Nestle. So Nestle takes the product. We have to pay for it anyways.
Yeah.
BOA steps in, pays the vendor. So the liability is with Nestle, not with the vendor. It's Nestle paying them, so they're not adding risk, and that's why they're using Nestle's credit rating, because Nestle is now liable for that debt, not the vendor. So, does that answer your, I think that's what you were asking.
Yeah, so Thomas, to your question, and to Alvin's point, literally you create another vendor, Bank of America, and Bank of America is the vendor that will help you pay the obligation to. So it's from a technological perspective, or technology perspective, it's super easy to implement, and ideally, actually, we'd like to pay all our suppliers through that platform. Right? Single vendor, you save money on that, so a lot of de-risking as well.
To both of you gentlemen as well, so I speak loud enough. On a similar type of question, that we do a lot of importing from China and India. Most of our vendors in China are self-financing because of net 60, with no factory and no bank involved. Out of India, we're switching to net 90, but a lot of factory agents are involved. My question to both of you is, what do you do on an individual PO basis when you have a QC problem? Your cargo arrives to the States, for example, you open up the container, holy crap, this is not what I ordered, or it doesn't meet the standards. Through a factory agent or a bank, they've been paid already. And assuming it's not a secondary follow-up PO, you can pull the handle for hostage. What's your recourse?
So in our case, the suppliers that we use, we have a long history with. So we have a pretty robust RTB program, return to vendor program, and that's relatively successful in our case. What we try to, we initiate payments based on when we take title to the product at the FOB, right, which is typically prior to inspection, to your point. So in our case, because of the history, we are able to have a very robust RTB program. And before we send invoices over to Bank of America to settle, we apply credits directly to the supplier's account. So that makes it a lot easier for the suppliers to understand. And we inform them before we actually initiate that process. But to your point, if you're not going to have future orders with the supplier, there is some risk. But I would like to elaborate with this program, because we've been able to transition suppliers from deposit payment terms to net 60 effectively. We've de-risked a lot of, provide a lot of de-risking, because in the cases where we've canceled POs, it was difficult to claw back money because you've already applied the deposit to the supplier. So we've eliminated that risk by going to this program.
Yeah, so it reminds me of letters of credit, right? Same kind of scenario. But if you have a customer that you have a going relationship, you're procuring same peanut, same chocolate, right, cocoa. So you have a recurring, you have a backlog of orders anyways, and orders that you're receiving, that you haven't paid, you can always deduct. It's not a problem. You can always dispute it. Retailers do it all the time. If it's a one-time, like a machinery, it's a different type of risk, because you might pay for that machine under normal terms, up to 90% of its value before it's actually delivered and installed in your premises. So you're talking about a different risk. And the only way to mitigate that risk is set up some kind of contractual mechanism, leverage. For example, an escrow account. If there's a problem, there's that escrow account, but maybe the letter of credit is delayed in paying. But be careful, because in experience, not necessarily but in general experience, I've seen where products are delivered and the quality issue is not there, but the terms of the letter of credit or the delivery was delivered. Nothing about, hey, is it to your specification? So it's all about perfecting the terms of the contract to protect yourself.
Okay.
You know, I think it was last year, Lowe's participated, and they mentioned that they do an 8% defective merchandise allowance provision. We would probably never get away with that. I thought that was a good way to mitigate the concern that Daniel has.
But you know, one of the biggest problems in consumer packaged goods is the rising level of reductions. There's more and more reductions out there. So it's a trend. So,
One question, is it a small supplier or is it a large supplier? runs the gamut. It's normally a new vendor.
Yeah.
So you do inspection services? We do. In fact, we do exactly that. We hire a third party QC, or I myself go visit the vendor and do a QC on spot. No, in that case, well, we're spending additional cost of the QC, which is normally the manager. Thank you.
Just one more comment on that. On the automation side, right, in terms of technology, we are absolutely being asked to provide automated credit note netting against debit invoices. And so the early payment offer is on a residual value. And so that is in the market today, and it's fully synchronized with the ERP and the payments and receivables on the balance sheet. So that's where technology is coming in. I think it was Pete that was saying that they do some reconciliation of credit notes and then they send a file and all of that. Great. But that's going on as well.
A question that perhaps everyone else in the room knows the answer to. This all makes so much sense. How did you get things done before? How did you get things done before supply chain finance?
That's a great question. It's like life before Google, right? How did you look things up? That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, we do a very traditional payables manner, right? Use Oracle, funded our suppliers. I think the answer is just it was a very traditional manual.
Do you think, I mean, were you extending terms? Is that the
No,
catalyst?
we had no terms extension prior to implementation of this program. It was early pay, it was prepay, it was net 15, we had probably 100 payment terms, and now we're standardizing on half a dozen, and transitioning all emergent suppliers to net 60. I mean, if I think about the program, I hope you guys, a lot of you have this program in place. I think about things like operating cycle improvement, the day payables, outstanding improvement, risk mitigation, the working capital improvement, the ease of implementation, the benefit of the payables treatment versus indebtedness, the affordability to suppliers. So for us, and hopefully for you, it really makes sense to look at this type of solution.
You know, to your point, it was done. The only thing is that technology provides transparency, and transparency provides more efficiencies. If you think about it, spice routes, it would take months to get spice from Norway to Europe, from Europe to the Americas. Well, now you can get it overnight, okay? So technology provides more transparency provides more opportunity for competitive advantages. So it was always done. It's just that the transparency adds a different level, a different dynamic, so that things can be done more efficiently, and everything is viewable and careful.
I was just going to comment from a supplier point of view, if they couldn't afford to build a receivable, they probably factored at very high cost.
Right.
So that's what was being done.
That's an easy win. I mean, when you provide them the cost analysis, when you reduce it from a fixed 4 or 5% to 65 basis points, it's an easy win. The factoring companies hate us.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I mean, the last time I looked at the statistic, going back 2-3 years, the factoring industry, I don't know if it's just North America or worldwide, was $3-4 trillion of receivables being factored. It's just, enormous. It gets grown since then. But technology also has enabled scale across the supply chain so that even the smallest suppliers can participate, et cetera, et cetera.
Could you guys each address, I mean, we've been talking about working capital and factoring and all of that, all important stuff, but at the risk of being a little bit of a broken record, could you address your perception of infrastructure investment? That could be data infrastructure or physical infrastructure, and your perception of where that bucket's headed and the implications on profitability going forward in your organizations.
let me start on that from a macro perspective. It gets into the public sector support for private sector operations in many respects, but there's a significant and growing on the IT side, private sector element of that. And we see that in companies trying to manage their overall supply chain, where infrastructure costs have their own project ROIs, and oftentimes negotiating that with the supply chain partners in terms of where the investment pays off for which partner and how much, or involving the third-party suppliers such as ourselves or other fintech suppliers. I think where it gets much more difficult is for companies trying to influence where the public sector has a role in that. And that's not just a physical port, it's also things like we heard a keynote on the digital port of Rotterdam. There's investments in the global supply chain trading network that can benefit all participants if, in many cases, the public sector were to step up and make investments in doing so. There are many obstacles to that. Some of them are lack of international standards, a lack of political will to pursue it, and I think there's clearly a lack of understanding of the benefits and the productivity gains that could accrue from it, in part because in some cases those are relatively recent. They're new and not something that are well understood, especially in the public sector where some of those big ticket investment decisions are made. And made sometimes for political reasons, not financial or economic reasons anyway.
I think there's, we don't have those types of issues, but I think there's always a dilemma between how much you invest in infrastructure, IT and other competing priorities in an enterprise, right, where you can invest your money. But clearly, one thing that we get out of this program is predictability. So if you're a publicly traded company, the street loves predictability, right? They don't like the surprises one way or the other. So this provides our supplier with predictability about when they're going to get paid, and provides us predictability about how much cash and working capital we're going to report at any given time. So that's, and this was, again, an easy solution for us to implement because it's a very simple solution. So, yeah, so I think that's where we stand on issues.
My 2 cents, I focus on survivability and competitiveness. You don't invest in CapEx in your company. When someone mentioned, how did you do this before the internet? How did you do this before? Can you imagine if you don't invest in your capacity and your operations and you be competitive, you become irrelevant. And with the fast pace of technology changes, you can become irrelevant really fast. Okay? So it's crucial that you invest in technologies because technologies are conducive to efficiencies. Efficiencies are conducive to profitability. And the investment is also conducive to competitiveness. And that's conducive to the survival of your organization. So that's the way I would view it.
I'll just comment about some real examples that we run into because, again, when the CFO says, Chris, our goal is $500 million in release cash this year, how can you help us? I always ask why. What do you need $500 million for? Well, Telstra, one of our customers down in Australia, they need that money to invest in all of the capital required for their move to 5G infrastructure. Very expensive, very, very costly infrastructure capital expenditures. Another one of our customers, AstraZeneca, is releasing hundreds of millions to the balance sheet for new drug R&D investment. It costs $1 billion to bring a new drug, to market. That's probably an understatement. So huge capital investments that need to be made by these large corporates. A couple of examples there.
Let's go with the last question so that you can head into your lunch.
Twofold. First, Incoterms, any specific for the finance programs to change anything on the Incoterms? And also, have you done any financing or extended credits when the product is still in transit?
We have not changed our Incoterms. We take title and we have what we want to usually the supplier ships from. Sort of a segue on that because of all the issues going on with China, we have sort of looked at eliminating or impacting tariffs slightly by taking title in the U.S. But with respect to the program specifically, we didn't change the Incoterms. We take title and we have what we want to do for the supplier ships.
I'm not aware of change in terms of explain.
Paul, you see anything? You have a very broad
I
perspective.
think in some of the larger industrial commodity markets, like in chemicals and in energy, there is some of that which occurs. Well, you even to the extreme when you have goods that are in transit that are traded, actually energy is changing hands. And in some cases, the markets are trading on that information and the cargoes are actually even redirected in extreme cases. So it happens, but it's within the niche of the industries where you would expect to find that resource commodities, extractive commodities being shipped and the products that are produced by those industries and how they're traded in lots. So it happens, but that's more the exception than a typical supply chain. And even in those industries, it's not something that's common.
All right, I'm going to wrap us up. I thank our panelists for sharing their experience and their journeys. I hope that as an audience, you've taken something away as well, best practices, what happened before supply chain financing, and that was a great question. And then also just, best practices around making sure you've got the right constituencies, making sure you've got the right support throughout the journey, the right funding partners, the right platforms, and having a vision for the future as well, not just solving for today. Thank you very much, everyone.